Hi, I'm Natalie from the East Coast of Canada, and I've been living in Latvia now for 2.5 years.
Hello,
Hi,
how are you?
good. How are you?
Good. It's nice to have another North American in our little story time.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And it'll be interesting to hear your perspective and your story. So tell us a little bit about where you're from.
Yeah, of course. From Canada, as I said, I grew up in Cape Breton, so an island on the East Coast, in a very small rural community. Um, And yeah, it's in some ways it's funny because it reminds me a little bit of here. There's definite differences, but I just grew up, in the countryside and surrounded by trees and living in small communities. And the biggest city wasn't it was smaller than Riga, but it's similar in the feel. And so I've always felt quite at home here, which is nice.
Oh, nice. And what do people do there? What's the industry and how do people keep themselves
Yeah.
busy?
There's a lot of fishing, of course. My parents are both teachers. My mom's a high school teacher. My dad teaches or taught electronics at community college. He retired a few years back. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of fishing and a lot of tourism now, of course. Um, well, and not in the last year because there's no tourism in the last year.
Yeah, yeah, nowhere.
No,
Except for
no, my
virtual
sister.
tourism.
Yeah, exactly. My sister still lives in the same small community. It's married, has 3 kids, and she's a nurse. And she and her husband also on the side have tourist cottages. They run a set of cottages for people coming to fish on the river or to do snowmobiling, lots of outdoor activities. Yeah.
Nice.
So
So
yeah,
very, you're describing like a very nature oriented community.
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, I don't also want to put myself forward as a real like avid outdoorsy person because I don't know that I'm that either. I do enjoy it,
Hmm.
but uh, but I've become quite a city girl in my adult life, which is the complete opposite. But it was nice to grow up that way. I'm from a big family, and my parents are still there, and my sister and 2 brothers are still there, and it's just nice to be able to go home and just enjoy that, go camping, go out in the river. Yeah.
Hmm. And anything else that you want to share about your childhood or how you grew up there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of 6 children, but I'm also my mom is one of 13, my dad is one of 12. So that's sort of the large extended family that I have.
Hmm.
So family was always huge. And both of my parents grew up in the same community and their families were based there. So we've got a long history in the area. And that really shaped sort of who I was growing up. I'm from a completely Scottish background, which is nowadays kind of rare in North America. Like everybody's an immigrant of some kind,
Hmm.
but usually you're mixed up a bit more in your heritage. And it's just such a small community that the Scots settled it, in 17th and 18th century and just kept to themselves. The
Hmm.
language survived. My grandparents' first language was Gaelic. And
Oh,
I grew
wow.
up, learning traditional Scottish recipes and things. And so again, I get here and I see a very different culture, but with similar sort of Northern European traditions that I can see mirrored in what I knew from growing up, which is
Hmm.
nice.
And did you at any point later on move to other parts of Canada?
Yes, I of course, at 17, I went to university in Halifax, which is, of course, the biggest city on the East Coast in Canada, and stayed there. I met my husband there. We lived there for, I don't know, 15 years or something crazy. Um, and then
That's
at that point,
significant.
we
Yeah.
moved to Ottawa, the nation's
Hmm.
capital. And we were there for 5 years
Hmm.
and before coming here. So yeah.
And what are those places like?
Um, Halifax is a maritime city right on the water. It's relatively small. It's less than, oh gosh, I'm the worst person in the world for like demographics and stats, but less than 500,000 anyway. I think it's about
Hmm.
400,000 people. So small. And it's just the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. And it's a big city for the region. You can have access to everything that you need, possibly. And culturally, there's theaters and there's cinemas and there's shopping and there's so much. And I worked at one of the bigger museums there, which I loved. It was one of my favorite jobs ever. But it's still small, and you're still so close to the ocean, and you're still so close to nature, which is really nice. And then Ottawa, again, Ottawa is the nation's capital, but in a very typical way, it's not even close to the biggest city in Canada. We sort of chose a sort of small, out of the way city to make our capital in. And it's about 1 million people, not quite 1 million. So still relatively small in that way, but a big spread out city with lots of green space, lots of parks, lots of national historic sites, and just a gorgeous place to live. I would bike to and from work or skate on the canal on the way to work and back, so
ice skate.
Really, yeah. Ottawa has the largest outdoor skating rink in the world.
Wow.
I think if you skate the whole thing, we would do it once a year as a pub crawl, because there are 3 pubs that you can sort of like climb up off the canal and go into the pub and have a drink and then get back on the canal. So every February we would do that. And it was about 14 kilometers skating.
That, yeah. For me, hearing that makes it sounds particularly Canadian to me, because my associations with Canada are cold, so the ice makes sense, as well as hockey. So skating on ice, like that all kind of makes sense to me, even though I'm sure there are other, I was seeing some videos about how people in the Netherlands were also skating on the canals there, and that was a thing.
We were hoping for that here, actually, when we came and we saw the canal. We're like, oh, I bet, because it's so far north, it must freeze every winter. But it doesn't. No.
It moves too much.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I guess along those lines, especially now that you're living outside of Canada, what are things that you would identify from your own opinion and your own experience are particularly Canadian? Like, how would you describe Canadians as people, and also Canada as a place, to people who just aren't familiar with it?
It's funny because there's all the stereotypes that you immediately go back to. Canadians are supposed to be so nice, which is, and I don't think it's not true, but I also think it's such a huge oversimplification. But perhaps more superficially nice, more friendly. Like I'm a bit of an introvert, which sometimes surprises people because I don't always act it. But in Canada, there's always small talk. Everybody wants to chat with you. You can't go anywhere. You sit in a taxi and you have to have conversation with the taxi driver from the start to the finish. You're in the line at the grocery store, you're making conversation with the people in front or behind you, and then with the cashier, which when you're an introvert is exhausting. Like going out doing anything is so exhausting because you just have to keep that up. And so that, to me, I didn't realize, I don't think, that is not the way that things are everywhere. So I suddenly getting here and sort of, because when you travel, you don't see it as much either, because you're not actually grocery shopping when you're traveling. You might have to get some groceries, but you're in a very different mindset. So here, to just start living a life and start realizing what's different, that was one of the things. It's just that lack of that small talk, the chatting with strangers, the expectation of it, because it happens here. It's not like nobody talks to you, but it's just not the norm. And I think that's a big thing in Canada, is it's very much, to be a polite person, you nod if you walk past somebody on the street. You wave, you say hello, you make small conversation, whether you're waiting in a doctor's office or in the line at the grocery store or wherever you are. And I think that's where that sort of nice stereotype comes from. It's because, even if we are thinking awful things, we're going to smile at you and make polite conversation.
Yeah.
And we've got a little bit more of that sort of rugged, outdoorsy thing. To a degree, obviously, like I said, I don't think I'm an outdoors person, and I know I'm not. And yet, yes, I go camping, and yes, I like to go hiking, and yes, I will do all these things, but just maybe not in a sort of really active more aggressive way that you think of when you think of an outdoorsy person. So yeah.
And simply because Canada has a landscape that's much more wild and more space. And
I think so. And that's a big part of it too, is the space. Because I think we just naturally have this sort of sense of our personal space that you don't get anywhere else. That's not a Latvian thing. It's almost anywhere that I've traveled, is that I expect people to sort of move around me. I expect to have certain sort of buffer between myself and people in a lineup somewhere, or walking down the sidewalk, whatever it is. We're just used to space everywhere because we have so much of it. Even our crowded cities don't compare to crowded cities elsewhere. They're not what other people would call crowded. So there's a very different sense of both space on a sort of a large scale and that personal space. Getting used to having people close. I mean, 2 meter spacing here now is like, okay, God, you can stay over there. I like you a lot. Stay there.
And what an interesting contrast too between this idea that you talk to people and you acknowledge people, but also that physically you give them space. So you're kind of still engaging with that person, but you're not overstepping like an invisible line of physical space.
Yeah. And I'm also somebody who grew up, like I said, very rural, like always space everywhere around me. So I would see that maybe a much more in a more extreme way than somebody who grew up in downtown Toronto. But
and as you grew up a little bit later in university, did you think about traveling? Did you travel?
Growing up, not a lot. I mean, I remember, I think 89, we took a family trip to Toronto, and that was huge. We drove. There was I had 3 siblings at the time. There was 4 of us, and mom and dad in a van. And that was a huge trip, and blew our minds coming from Cape Breton, where we just had never seen that many buildings or that many people. But that was about as far as it got for a long time. And I never really traveled through university or even my early adulthood. I had health problems that sort of kept me from doing that. So maybe I would have more. But yeah, I mean, my first real trip, it would have been in my mid-20s. And my husband was traveling for work, and we kind of worked it out. And I met up with him, and we did Paris and Rome together. And it was just mind-blowing. And that kind of just kicked it off. So yeah.
And so you're saying it kicked it off. It made you want to travel more.
Yeah, exactly. And we began to really plan it. It became what we did, like we didn't necessarily buy a new television. We never had a fancy car. We didn't do a lot of things with the money that we saved. It was always, where can we go? What can we experience? So we did a lot of Europe, a little bit of the Caribbean, and, like nice winter trips, because when it's minus 25 or minus 30 out, a week in Cuba is really nice. But we also, we did an African safari, and we just really took advantage of any opportunity to travel. I worked for the provincial government for a long time, and had a lot of sort of collaborative work. So I was back and forth to the United States a lot, mostly the southern US, because it was usually the easiest place to put on conferences, because you didn't have to plan around weather like you did in Canada. So we would spend a lot of time in Florida and Georgia and various places in the South, which was nice. Yeah.
Nice.
But we've been traveling a lot since, so probably the last 15 years. Yeah.
Nice. And you had told me a little bit too about having spent maybe not a significant amount of time, but a little bit of time outside of Canada. Tell us about that.
Yeah. When we did the trip to do the African safari, my husband was working overseas at the time. And again, I was meeting up with him, and that was sort of our goal. Was we went to the Seychelles first to have just a week of beach vacation. But the safari had always been my dream. One thing that I really wanted to do if I ever got the chance. And so we went to Tanzania. We did a week-long safari, but then he had to go back to work. And I had finally sort of, as I was planning it, I was thinking, I'm finally getting to Africa to see this whole other continent that I would love to explore. I don't want to just go for a week. like I'll take it if that's all I can figure out.
Right.
But I spoke with my boss and I was able to work out a leave of absence without pay, unfortunately. But I planned it well in advance and I saved a lot of money and I figured out exactly how long I could be gone, basically. So I spent almost 3 months in Tanzania and I was teaching at a school for orphans. I lived on site. There was a home that had been built there many years before, so that volunteers who could come would have a place to stay, essentially. And so that was my first experience living outside of Canada. And I mean, I say living, I wasn't living on my own super independently, but I was outside of Canada for months at a time. And I was, relying on myself to get around Dar es Salaam and around Tanzania. We did as much travel as we could. I got to go to Zanzibar for a weekend with some of the other volunteers. Went down to the south of the country to Mikumi National Park and again did some more safari adventures. And we were there because the mother of one of the volunteers actually worked at the park, so we got to go and really see it. And we stayed in the park staff cabins, and like we were warned, the outhouse is here, we're going to go in the middle of the night, check for lions first. Like, oh, okay. So again, just a really nice, sometimes scary experience of just being somewhere else. And I was an adult, I had just turned 30. But again, because I'd had health problems earlier on, I'd never taken that risk before. And so, my husband was working overseas. My dad would call me and email me every now and then, just making sure I was okay. Do you need medicine? Are you fine? I'm fine, Dad. So, but it was, it was a learning experience, to live somewhere so different.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask is so maybe it wasn't exactly like you were living independently on your own, but still a significant experience of being in a vastly different culture.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, having to be independent, be an adult, and just what your major takeaways from like being rooted in a place for a while that was different.
I do remember coming home and sort of that, that reverse cultural shock, that adjustment again to just having so much, because living with so little, and again, like I lived with so much compared to the locals when I was there. I had a room to myself. I had a bathroom, even though it didn't always work. So there was, the food was usually fresh, but I was also used to, making toast in the morning and picking out the weevils first. And things that just became so common. And then getting home and somebody, wanting to throw out the watermelon because it didn't look good anymore. It's like, no, we can eat that. So you just sort of adjust your thinking, like what's good and what isn't, what's fresh and what isn't. And just sort of learning how to make do with a little bit less. It's simple things, but I lived most days, I didn't have hot water most of the days for my shower. Like I said, the bathroom didn't always work. For 3 months, I washed my clothes by hand, little things that I just didn't have to think about again when I got home. If I tried to wash my clothes today by hand, it's been over 10 years. I don't know what I would do, but I did it because I had to. So, yeah.
So it opened up a whole new line of thinking of, things could be a few different ways rather than just the way that you were used to it being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, just working with the students and I was running a drama club at the time. And I just remember nobody would come to rehearsal on time, which, people will say actually happens everywhere if you talk to some directors that I know. But it just wasn't, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but culturally, the idea of setting a time for something and having to be there is just looked at differently. Like, yes, of course we have rehearsal, but we haven't finished laundry, or we haven't finished homework, or we haven't finished whatever. So no, we can't go there yet. Why do you expect us to? So it made me sort of flip my thinking, because a North American way of thinking is so very much time oriented.
Yeah. And very concrete time.
Yeah.
Like this time means this time.
Exactly. It's not about after you finish homework. It's like, no, if it's 7 o'clock, it's 7 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a different thinking, you know, to show up for rehearsal, nobody's there, like, okay. Luckily, it was a boarding school. I knew where to find all of the girls. I just walked down to the residence and be like, hey, we're supposed to rehearse now. But yeah, it was just a different, you know, learning a different way of thinking.
So how did this whole thing happen? How did you end up then actually leaving Canada, and how and why Latvia, and living outside of the place that you're from?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because of the work my husband does, we do travel. Well, he travels a lot.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the first times I've gotten to go with him, you know, on any sort of permanent basis, not a 2-week trip. So yeah, it was a little while in sort of coming together. But ironically, we came to Europe on vacation in 2016 because again, we were going to be traveling to Prague for work reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought, okay, well, we've seen Prague. What else could we do? And we just sort of started looking around and thinking about places that each of us had wanted to visit before. And so we decided to tour the Baltics. So we flew in and out from Prague, in and out of Riga, and we did our own sort of tour. We rented a car, we drove around. It was 10 days. I mean, it's 3 countries. You can't see that much, but we, you know, 4 days in Riga, I think 3 days in Tallinn, and a bunch of time in the countryside. And we loved it. We were like, this place is so great. And that was September 2016, if I'm getting the dates right. A year later is when he was told that he might be being sent to Riga to live.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, when they heard that, you know, their first thing was, oh, okay, Latvia, well, where is that?
Mm-hmm.
They had a good idea, but, you know, so many people had never really thought about exactly where it was. Right. And he was like, oh, I was just there last year, which was kind of funny. And so we had, you know, it wasn't as scary, which was nice. We certainly didn't know a lot about Latvia, having only been here for, you know, less than a week. But we're like, oh, okay, well, we loved it there. We'd seen enough to know we wanted to see more. So we were totally intrigued by the idea of moving here. Mm-hmm. And so there's, of course, a process, and you have to be screened through. And, you know, working with government is never straightforward. So it took some time. But by July 2018, we were here. Mm-hmm. And we haven't looked back. You know, our plan when we found out for sure we were coming was, okay, so we're living in Riga for 3 years. We're going to be there for 3 years. We're not coming home, you know, barring some sort of awful something that would pull us back to Canada for any reason. We weren't going home for Christmas. We weren't going home for summer vacation. We were going to be here for 3 years.
Yeah, you were going to fully be in this place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I mean, so far, so good. COVID kind of, you know, messed with the plans a little bit, but also made us stay here, which was also, you know, advantageous in some ways because we've seen more of the country. You know, we can still travel within Latvia. And we're taking weekends and we're just going to small little guest houses here and there and just seeing another little community somewhere. Mm-hmm. And something that we might not have done as much as, you know, if we'd been able to travel a bit more. You know, the first year and a half here, we traveled quite a bit around Europe, but also still throughout the Baltics and in Latvia. We've been enjoying seeing the countryside. And then again, that comes, I think, from what I grew up with and what I like, but I want to walk in the forest. I want to pick the flowers or the mushrooms, you know, so I've really been enjoying that part of it.
And I would assume to a certain extent, I think when you come here for work, you have this automatic thing to get settled into, but you're kind of coming with him for his work. So what were some of the things that you did when you initially got here to adjust or figure this place out or settle in, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. One of the first things I did was try to learn some of the language. So I took a short course and I downloaded some software, and I've been, you know, I have very little, but people tell me I do all right. So, you know, I can order food, I can say thank you, etc. But just to feel that it really helped. It really helped to not walk in somewhere and not even be able to say hello. You know, like I needed that little bit. Mm-hmm. But one of the first things I did more socially is I joined a theater group, an international theater group. I used to be very involved in theater, and like all through high school, university. But again, having health problems in my early 20s and sort of throughout that early adulthood, I had to let it go. I just couldn't, you can't commit to things when your health is unsettled. So even then, by the time I had sort of gotten through that, I had been out of it for so long that I sort of had that fear. I didn't want to go back. I wasn't sure if I could do it anymore. And I got here and I was on Facebook, and there was just an ad looking for English speaking amateur actors. And they were meeting on my street. So I couldn't be, I couldn't say, oh, well, I don't know where that is. And I just thought, well, okay, if I'm going to try it, even if I'm terrible, like if I'm going to fail at it, nobody knows me. So I went. And I've been very active with that group now for 2.5 years. And I love it. It's how I met most of my local friends. And I mean, they're not all local as in Latvian. They're all English speakers. So they're locals who can speak English, or international students or other expats, but still a really great social group, which was nice. It was an instant social group, which is hard to find when you move somewhere,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And there is a relatively, I mean, it's not large, but a good sized Canadian community here. Those who are here with the military, with the government, but also because so many Latvians went to Canada, before and after the Second World War, but then came back after independence. And so, some of the good friends that we've made here are Latvians who were born and raised in Toronto, but then came back as adults, and now they're raising their families here. And that's a really interesting sort of just cultural phenomenon just to talk to people. And so you have conversations with them, and they in one moment they're very Canadian, and you're talking about the bands that you grew up listening to and life in Toronto in the 80s or whatever it might be. But then seconds later, they're clearly talking fluently in Latvian to someone else, or they're just saying or doing something that seems very Latvian. and they have that sort of dual identity, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And I think, part of why these conversations interest me, and I think interest people who are watching these videos, is this idea that when you're living in a place from a different home culture or culture of origin, it makes you think a lot about that place and how that place has influenced you, as well as kind of it makes then being in a new place makes things about that culture stand out as well. And you start to think about what can I adjust to? What do I kind of keep of my home culture? What do I do a little bit differently, or just like, what are the different paths I can take? And what were some of those things for you? What felt particularly Canadian that kind of came out? What did you observe about Latvians and Latvian culture?
I think a lot of it for me, how I sort of think about my own culture and what I've been seeing here is almost always through food. I mean, maybe somewhere else it might also sort of be through the literature or the song, but I don't know Latvian well enough to feel that really here. So I'm definitely seeing and feeling it through food. And I mean, between tasting and learning to make local foods, either on my own or with friends, but also sharing my traditions and my favorite foods and things to make. One of the bigger ones being just jams and preserves of any kind. I do it a lot at home. And a lot of the berries and the fruit here is the same, but there's also a lot of differences. So I'm just every year, I'm picking or buying whatever I can get, tasting it and adapting, my grandma's recipe for blueberry jam to use a local berry instead, and just trying things and then sharing. Just everybody, I make a batch of jam and I keep 1 or 2 of them, and then anybody who wants to try it. So that's always been a huge part of it, and a huge part of, I think, I'm not sure how it compares really to Latvian, but a big part of maritime Canadian culture is that entertaining and inviting people to your home, and having not even necessarily a party. I mean, we'd call it a ceilidh in Cape Breton, which is of course a Gaelic word for a visit. People think it's a Gaelic word for a party, but it's a visit. And just having people close to you and enjoying food and enjoying conversation and jokes and stories and music. And so we, as much as we can, we do not have the space here that we have at home with an actual house, but inviting people in and just sharing our food and inviting them to bring their food and talk and stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
What were some of the differences or challenges you came up against being in a completely different place?
Language is of course the obvious one, but how that sort of spills over into everything, right? So trying to learn where to, how to rent a car, where to get something fixed. I mean, our first few weeks here, I remember we had to, buy certain things. We brought our pots here and found out that our stove in our apartment is induction. So we was okay, we need new pots. And it's simple enough, but when you can't read a sign in a store, when you really just don't know where to go to find pots,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it was harder than it had to be. We wanted to buy a couch and we couldn't figure out the Latvian word for furniture. I mean, it was so obvious once we figured it out, but we walked into stores everywhere. We couldn't figure out how to buy a couch. And now we drive around and there's, furniture stores everywhere, and it really should have been easier. But that's that combination of not knowing the language and that feeling of overwhelm, mm-hmm. just not even knowing how to start, not even where to start, just how to start. What do I do? What do I do first? Do I look up the word? Do I call somebody? Do I get on Google? Whatever it is. So that was probably, it was the language, but it was a bit of everything. And I mean, shopping, or even just public services, government services, everything, the culture of service is different. And I know that it's even different between Canada and the US, whereas, the USA has very much the customer is always right sort of policy, mm-hmm. and service is above and beyond. Anytime I travel to the USA, I'm sort of overwhelmed by service. But it is similar in Canada. And here, I mean, I find all over Europe, not just in Latvia, but here it's just not the same. So, if you go into a store and you ask somebody, do you sell couches? You get no.
Yes.
And then they turn around and they continue doing whatever they were doing. But in Canada, you would get oh no, I'm so sorry, we don't. I mean, we have chairs. Do you want a chair? We could sell you 3 mm-hmm. chairs and you could make a couch, or over here, and they take out their phone and they look up everywhere mm-hmm. close to you that's going to sell you a couch.
Here's the place that you can go.
Yeah.
I'll help send you on your way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So that was sort of overwhelming too. Figuring out, I find to get what you're looking for here, you have to ask the right question.
Mm-hmm.
And
how do you figure out the right question when you're exactly. not from that place?
Yeah. Because it's not that people aren't helpful. And that's, our first few weeks or months, we kind of felt like, oh, nobody wants to help. But it's just a different way of thinking about things. So you didn't ask them the right question. How could they possibly help? So yeah, that was a bit of a struggle. And it sometimes still is. We know it now, but we're still Canadian. We mm-hmm. still, it's not really ingrained. So we still go out and think that we can do something the way that we always have done it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah.
And so you've been here for almost 3 years, right?
Yeah.
What do you think you'll take away from this experience?
I do like that life is just generally more relaxed. I run a business and I've been doing less of it, but some of it from here. And, at home, I was always very much like, if an email came in from a potential client at 10 at night, you write them back because you need that business and you need to do this and you need to do that. And within about 6 months of getting here, I really pulled back on that. Like my expectations for myself, but also just my realization that the world doesn't have to be like that. If they need my service, they're still going to need it tomorrow morning, and I can write them back at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. and they're still going to be fine. And I mean, it wasn't even a theoretical thing. Like nobody has ever complained about that.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's ever said, I can't believe you didn't write me back at 10 p.m.
Yeah.
So, it's more of an expectation that I've set for myself, just from again, just seeing people do things a little bit differently, a little less sort of time driven. But yeah, I want to continue to enjoy what's around me more when I go home, and we're really enjoying getting out into the countryside and just seeing new things, small things, a new nature trail, a new castle or moija or anything. And it doesn't have to be big, and it doesn't have to be a weekend trip. We can hop on the motorcycle and just go and enjoy it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, any final thoughts?
I don't know. We're caught right now in this sort of waiting phase where, almost 3 years in, and we're eager to get home. We're eager to see family and sort of get back to what we're used to, but we know also how much we're really going to miss it here. It feels strange to think that I'm coming to the end of my time in Riga. And I, in some ways, feel like it's not the end of my time in Riga. And I don't know what that means yet, whether we'll just come back every now and then to visit or find a way to come back again on a more, maybe not permanent, but on another stint, come back for another few years, find a way to extend. Yeah, we've really enjoyed it. And I think it helps that we sort of had that from the beginning, just feeling a little bit like home, like that really the communities were similar size, proximity to nature, similar climate, really has just all helped us to feel like this is a home away from home.
Nice. What a lovely thought. Yeah. I like that. We'll end it there, but thank you so much for sharing your interesting story and different from some of the ones that we heard before. So
thank you. Yeah, it's been lovely. Yeah.